Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
We're studying this morning in the book of John, chapter 12, verse 23. As we left off last Lord's Day, we had seen that there were Greeks there at that time, and they came to Philip asking to see Jesus. And Philip went to Andrew, and Andrew and Philip then went to tell Jesus. And in verse 23, Jesus answered them, saying, "The hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. But if any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve him, him will my Father honor. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this cause came I unto this hour. Father, glorify thy name." Then came there voice from heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." The people therefore that stood by and heard it said that it thundered. Others said an angel spake to him. Jesus answered and said, "This voice came not because of me, but for your sakes. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me." This he said, signifying what death he should die. We'll stop there and see how we do with it. But as we were mentioning last week, as the lesson was coming to a conclusion, when the Greeks came looking for Jesus, those probably who had been in the court of the Gentiles, those who in other places perhaps were in the synagogue in the area reserved for the Gentiles. There was a place reserved in the synagogue specifically for the Gentiles or the nations to come. They did not interact directly with the children of Israel. They didn't come in and sit down beside of you. There was a lot of things, of course, as we've studied before, about clean and unclean and Gentiles and separating ourselves out from the world when it came to Judaism. And so they had a special place. So somewhere along the way, these Greeks had learned about Jesus, and they had learned, if they were at the synagogue or the temple, about the hope of the Messiah that was supposed to be coming. And there was much said and much talked and much discussed about Jesus. And so they wanted to see him. And when others of the nations began to come looking for Jesus, he saw this clearly as a sign, and of course, knowing how things were going to play out, he points to this as one of the things showing and signifying that the time of his earthly ministry among the Jewish people was complete. The gospel was not only ready to be preached among the nations, beginning there at Jerusalem, but literally going out into all the world. People were beginning to come and look and seek Jesus from other nations, people who were not in and of themselves Jewish by birth. And Jesus said, "Verily, verily," or "Surely, surely, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." We know that what he's talking about here is the seed and the kernel in wheat. And if it's just saved or kept, that's all that there is. But in the hopes of it being planted, and the vision of that is being planted, the one seed dies, but it produces much fruit. And so, having, over the years looked at different writers, it seems that a head of wheat usually has something like 33, 66, or 99 kernels in the top. If it's a dry year, poor year, it will usually produce about 33. If it's an average year, 66. And if it's a perfect growing season, it gets up to almost 100 fold. And so this is something they were quite aware of. And Jesus, by using this symbolism, talks about his death. And so there comes a time when we have to move to the next step. And so there comes a time of planting, and then there's a time of watering, and then there is a time of growth and harvest. And so Jesus started his earthly ministry about 3.5 years before this. He's been through the areas of Galilee, Judea, Samaria. He's been over what we would call Trans-Jordan, over into the area that today on a map usually is marked by the country of Jordan. And so he's traveled around considerably, speaking, teaching, performing miracles. And it's been, a time of growth, planting the seeds of the kingdom, both him as well as his disciples. But he goes on to say, "He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal." And this is in keeping with some of the things that Jesus teaches in Matthew 16, other places, about if we want to live our life solely for our benefit, for our pleasure, it's in many ways just like the grain of wheat. It kind of dies alone, and there is nothing else. But if one is willing to sacrifice the things of this life in the service, especially of God, then he will keep his life, or keep it into life eternal. And so the service to Jesus has an eternal reward, while service to the flesh only satisfies the thing of this life. And so life becomes a test to see whether or not we will sacrifice for the short-term pleasures, or if we're willing to sacrifice the short-term pleasures for long-term gains. And this plays out in many different ways in the financial markets and otherwise. But as we look at this, he's specifically talking about, if we save our life, we'll lose it. If we lose our life for his sake, we'll find it. And of course, in Matthew 16, it's not the same place, but he mentions this same thing, question anyway. What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? And this principle, this precept was the same way with Jesus. He had a purpose, he had a reason for coming into this life. And coming into this life was not to get a good job, to get a good education, to marry well, and to have a home and raise a family. That's the normal things of life. The birds of the air have nests, the foxes have holes, but Jesus said the Son of Man had not where to lay his head. So he didn't have a lot of possessions that really belonged to him. He didn't put down a lot of roots because he also knew that he wasn't going to be around much after his 33rd year or so. We know it was supposed he started his ministry around the age of 30. And so he speaks about those who are willing to serve him, and they must follow me. Take up the cross, follow me. Same sermon. Different place, but it's still the same sermon. It may be spoken a little differently, but it's that same process. If we take up our cross daily, follow him, serve him, him will my Father honor. The honor comes from serving and being a servant and doing the things that God wills us to do. Anything down through 26? Questions, observations? "27 is one of those verses that shows the humanity of Jesus as well as his understanding of his divine purpose for being there. He says, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this cause came I unto this hour." As we have said before, Jesus many times makes that statement, my hour is not yet come. My hour is not yet come. But now Jesus sees that his hour has come. The time of his offering and those principles are ready that he's been living for. And so he does mention the fact that his soul is troubled. And there are many different reasons why one would experience these types of troubling scenarios. Just beyond himself, there is the suffering, there is the beating, there is the things that he knows he's going to experience, and that's troubling. Unless there's something a little bit off with us, most people do not enjoy a great deal of pain and suffering. So that can be troubling. When we have surgery, we may have one of the best surgeons around, and we might be in one of the best hospitals, but it still doesn't mean that our soul isn't troubled over the events that are about to take place. Beyond that, Jesus also knows that this will be the downfall and the demise of Judas. Over the time that Judas had been with them, we know that John mentions that he was a thief and he stole from the purse, and Jesus, I'm sure, was aware of that, as much as he was aware of all the other things that were around him. The difficulties, the things that Peter would go through and others. And so it wasn't just his suffering, but there was literally an eternal consequence for some in the events that are going to take place, how his disciples will respond to it, and just, that. And so while he, in the Garden of Gethsemane, literally did pray, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. I think that there's an important part in that, and I've said this for many years now. That prayer is not just his desire, of course, if there was another way, but much more than that, his prayer becomes a teaching moment for us in that he asks, if there be any other way, let that cup pass. And it didn't. And he went through those things, and we need to understand that there is no other way. And here, shortly, as we get on over in the 14th chapter, verse 6, we'll find the statement Jesus makes, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And part of that is through his suffering and through his atonement. And as we read in the book of Hebrews, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. And we see in Hebrews 9, the Hebrew writer talks about that the blood of Christ was not only shed for the New Testament, but also for those that were under the First Testament or the first covenant with God. And so he makes a statement, prayer, Father, glorify thy name. Then came there a voice from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. It's interesting, verse 29, John says, the people therefore that stood by and heard it said, it thundered. The voice out of heaven. When God speaks out of heaven, whether it's now or even with the children of Israel in the wilderness, we remember the voice of God that thundered in the wilderness on the mountain as God first began to speak to the children of Israel. And it terrified them so much that they basically asked that he not speak to them anymore, that, send Moses and let him talk to God. Because the sound of the voice as it thundered terrified the people. And so here we have that sort of a flashback to those moments. It literally thundered. The sound of that was so loud. And others said an angel spake to him. They heard a voice but saw no one. And so some said that in this moment or in this point in time that an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus answered and said, this voice came not because of me, but for your sakes. Jesus already knew what was going to happen and how things were going to play out. But this was another opportunity for the people who were on the fence setters. Things are already pushed to both ends in a way. And we have the religious leaders who have already made their decision, the Sanhedrin. And then, we have those who have embraced him as the Christ, but there's still many that are trying to figure out which way they're going to go in all of this. So Jesus said that the voice that thundered, that they understood or thought to be an angel speaking to him, was intended to help them make a decision as to what they were going to do. Now, Wednesday night I told you to download, if you had a chance to download the 3 pictures that I put up there, or at least look at them. But in one of the pictures was the Sanhedrin Council, and we kind of showed the layout of the room where the Sanhedrin met. It was referred to in the temple as the room of the hewn stones, and this was all the way up in the temple. And so in those 3 pictures, you will see the assembly of the Sanhedrin, the leaders, the high priest, the students that were there. And this is kind of interesting because those who were students of many of those who were in the Sanhedrin, depending on which way you want to pronounce it, had a place there also where they sit and listened to the governing body, in essence, of Israel. And so this is one of those places where I've always wondered, since Paul was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was part of the Sanhedrin, and he was a student of Gamaliel, was he sitting there in these seats for the students listening to these discussions that they had about Jesus and the impact that Jesus was having, and when Jesus was on trial, and some of the things that took place, was Paul there. And again, the scriptures are pretty much silent on that. But you can see, if you look at the diagram of where the Sanhedrin met, it is out of the reach of the average Jewish person. Anyone, Gentile included, could come into the temple, to the court of the Gentiles, and where the portico of Solomon was, Solomon's porch. But beyond that, only Israelites could enter. And the first place they entered to in the temple was the court of the women, which also had the treasury. And beyond that, only the men of Israel could pass to the court of Israel. And then, beyond that, only the priests and those who governed Israel were allowed to go. And so the Sanhedrin council met in what I keep saying, their little hidey hole. They had that room specifically for themselves, in a place that only the priests and only those in the Sanhedrin and only those who were their students could come into. And if you were brought in there for another reason, it was usually because you had been placed under arrest and brought before the Sanhedrin, or had some kind of business with them. But beyond that, their meeting there in that place was not open as we think of things today. And so there's a lot of, I say that and we talk about that because there's still a lot of people who are sitting on the fence, of the Jewish leaders, of the people that are kind of in the middle. And so when Jesus is speaking here, he answered and said that the voice came for their sakes. And he says, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. In Hebrews, the 2nd chapter, in verse 15, the Hebrew writer speaks about the death of Jesus Christ in taking on him our likeness as a human. And it talks about that through death, he had the power to destroy the devil, to destroy his hold upon those who were alive and also those who had sinned. The forgiveness of sins were possible, and so Jesus come to destroy him that had the power of death, and that was the devil. And so he speaks of the fact that now is a time that true judgment, not eternal final judgment, but judgment is coming to the world. You know, everything was looking forward to the coming of Jesus and what would happen when Jesus came, and the cross and those things. And as we know now, everything looks back toward the cross, but the things that had happened. And so the events that take place there in the next few days is truly a sense of judgment and of making of judgment and bringing judgment to the devil, destroying him that had the power of death. And Jesus said, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. And this is something that he discussed with Nicodemus back in John, the 3rd chapter, talking about as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And he speaks to the hope there, if he be lifted up from the earth, that will draw all men or all mankind. And actually it's in italics, so what it really says is, if he's lifted up, he will draw all unto me. And so we're talking about all of mankind here, not just men. But it's the opportunity through the gospel to draw and appeal. And it says, this he said, signifying what death he should die. And of course, that death that he should die was the death on the cross of Calvary. And so all of the things that we're looking at now and studying is contradictory to a large portion of the denominational world. That, this concept that Jesus came to set up a kingdom and he was rejected of men, and all these things happened, his death, his burial, all of this. God raised him from the dead, and he gave us the church to substitute until such time as he could come back and reestablish the kingdom. And I have over the years, and you've heard me say it, I call it ambush theology. They act as if God didn't know what was going to happen, and these religious people caught God off guard and ambushed him, and these weak, insignificant people in this hidey hole up there in the temple somehow could thwart and change all the plans of God. And in all of this, John keeps showing us that Jesus knew that he had an hour. He knew that there was a certain time that he was moving toward. And here he realizes that he has reached that point in time. And just as much as he spoke to Nicodemus in John 3 about being lifted up, talking about or signifying the death that he would die, even so here, before all the things start going sideways, as some would like to think of it, he's speaking to the people, talks about the fact that he was going to die, he would be buried, he would bring forth much fruit, that the prince of this world would be judged, and that he would be lifted up on the cross. And there are many ways that even the Romans could put you to death, depending on the circumstances and situations that were going on. But here, Jesus specifically is aware that he is going to be crucified. And he specifically speaks about his death. And so if he was that much aware of what was taking place, it would be exceptionally easy for him to just backtrack, regroup, get his army together, and march on Jerusalem and defeat them if that's what he wanted to do. But Jesus continues to move forward and progress forward in moving toward the cross. And we see some of the fence sitters, so to speak, some of those who were the holdouts. And while Jesus is speaking about this, John says the people. Now it's interesting because John speaks a lot about the Jews. And he's speaking about most of the time the Jewish leaders, not the Jewish people. But here he doesn't use the term the Jews, but he speaks about the people. This seems to imply these are the people who were involved in what we think of as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, those who were expecting him to save them, to deliver them, who were looking forward to the ultimate war, so to speak, between God and his people and his king and the kings of the world. And so in verse 34 it says, the people answered him, we have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever. And how sayest thou, the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? The people had, just like today, a concept in their head that they just couldn't see beyond. As much as people today are looking for Jesus to come back and set up an earthly kingdom that's going to reign and rule for 1,000 years and all the things that go with it, these people couldn't see beyond what they had been taught about the Messiah, the Christ. And so it says, we have heard out of the law. This is a powerful thing. We have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever. And there are many different verses that talk about the reign of the Messiah on the throne of David. In Daniel, the 2nd chapter, in verse 44, we have that prophecy, the dream there of the image, and we see that the image ultimately, the feet, that was Rome. In the days of those kings, God would establish a kingdom which would be forever. And so in their mindset, that means that Jesus is going to live here on earth forever, or the Messiah is going to live here on earth. That's all that they see. Daniel 7, verse 14, Daniel 7, verse 27, Psalms 110, verse 4, 2 Samuel 7, 13 is a prophecy that was made to David, and David's descendant would sit on his throne, and he would establish that throne. And there's many other verses. This is a central part of what the Old Testament theologians at that time were teaching about the coming of the Messiah, setting up this everlasting kingdom here on earth. And so the people began to ask him, the Messiah is not going to die. The Messiah is going to be here forever. And they understood what he meant by being lifted up. Now, you can use that term today, and people would think of all kinds of different things, lift them up. But they knew with that phrase, the Son of Man be lifted up, that he was talking about crucifixion. Because they understood that this lifting him up implied his death. And that was not consistent with the theology that they were clinging to. And so the Messiah is going to live on and reign forever. And so the Son of Man, that you're talking about, who is this Son of Man? And they were embracing Jesus as the Messiah. They had embraced him as the Messiah, and that's what the whole triumphal entry thing was. They had hoped that this was the time that he would save them and deliver them from Rome and everyone else, and fulfill the promises that had been made. And so the Messiah was going to live forever. So who is this Son of Man? If Jesus is the Messiah, in their mind, he's going to live forever. So now he's talking about this Son of Man, this human, in essence, who is going to be crucified and die. And who is this? We're kind of confused. You have the Son of Man over here being lifted up and dying, and we have the Messiah over here that lives forever, so they can't be the same person. So now they're asking who the Son of Man is. Then Jesus said unto them, Yet a little while is the light with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness come upon you. For he that walketh in darkness knoweth not whither he goeth. If we look at that close enough, what we're basically saying is that the prophecies concerning the Messiah and the interpretation of those prophecies have left many people in darkness, believing in something, groping around in something that they're not going to be able to find. And Jesus was there as the light to enlighten them and show them the truth of those prophecies. And so his encouragement to them is to turn loose of the things that you've been told and the things that you believe, and the traditions and the customs that are keeping you in the dark. And while I'm here with you, spend some time learning what is about to take place, to find out about this. And so while he's talking, he says, These things spake Jesus and departed and did hide himself from them. Jesus understands that these people are expecting war. And I don't know what else to say, but they're expecting some magnificent battle to take place that, and again, whether it's with the Israelite people, if it's the host of heaven, whatever's going to take place, they're expecting something big. And Jesus is trying to get them to see and to understand that their expectations are greater and their theology is different. And that's what happens. We have to be very careful. And we're back to how can the Messiah live forever? And how then could the Messiah die? And they do not see that as being any way consistent. And even today, theologians say, well, he was supposed to have set up his kingdom, but the Jews rejected him. He was crucified. And so, he ascended back to heaven until he can come back and set up his kingdom. That's the way they try to deal with it today. The people were dealing with it in a different way back then. They couldn't reconcile. But when we look at the gospel, it reconciles itself. We have the Messiah who is going to continue forever, but he's also the sacrifice. And so he dies on the cross of Calvary. He's buried. He rises again on the third day, and he ascends back to the Father where he sits at the right hand of God, and he's there forever. And what Peter tells them on the day of Pentecost is exactly that. David spoke about someone who was going to be killed or die. He was going to be buried. His soul would not be left in hell. Neither would his body see corruption. Who do you think he was talking about? And Peter says that Jesus, that same Jesus that they crucified, God hath raised from the dead, exalted. He sits at the right hand of God. And it says, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that that same Jesus, that God has made him both Lord and Christ. And so the implication is he's on the right-hand side of God. He has been made king over his kingdom, and he's going to stay there as king over his kingdom until all of his enemies are made his footstool. And Paul speaks about that in 1 Corinthians 15. But Jesus also knows that this, for some of them, is just more than what they can grasp. if they want to know and if they want to ask and they're willing to learn, Jesus invites them to do that, but he also knows that they're not wanting, these fence setters, these people aren't wanting the real answer. As I said, they're wanting war. They're wanting him to annihilate the Romans, cast them out, and set down on a throne there in Jerusalem to reign over the exalted nation of Israel, who will subdue all the rest of the world to them. And so their idea is that they're going to take Rome, who has major control of the world, and they're going to overthrow Rome, and Israel will become the new Rome. It will have control over all the world, just like from Nebuchadnezzar's time, the Medes and Persians overthrew him, and then the Greeks overthrew the Medes and Persians, and the Romans overthrew the Greeks, and so now Israel is going to overthrow Rome. And Jesus knows this isn't going to work. They can't reconcile what he's trying to say to what they believe. And so as he does on many occasions, we're told that he left and he hid himself away from them, lest something even greater as far as a mistake would take place as far as trying to believe that they were going to go to war against Rome.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in his truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.